I'm very pleased to be here today. I work for BirdLife International. For those of you who don't know, BirdLife is a global partnership of about 120 national environmental NGOs. Many of them focused on bird conservation, but about half of them are broader biodiversity conservation organisations. I doubt that there's anyone in the room here that needs convincing that climate change is going to have a big impact on biodiversity, and many of you will be familiar with these sorts of images. This shows the projected impacts of climate change on the distribution of a bird, green-billed sunbird, found in the Alpine redfield of East Africa. It's based on climate envelope modelling, where you correlate the current distribution of species to climatic variables, and then apply that to models of projected climate change to see where the potential distribution of species may move to in the future. And this shows that compared to the present, the distribution of the species in red is likely to shift to higher altitudes and to shrink in size. If you do this for a whole suite of the endemic species, you find that there are going to be major changes in the community composition and distribution of these species. White shells over here. And similarly, there'll be major impacts on the there will be big impacts on the composition of communities at the site scale. Here we see an image of the important bird areas in sub-Saharan Africa, with the brighter colours, the red and orange, indicating the highest degree of turnover in the species of conservation interest for which these sites are identified. See that the degree of turnover in those species increases over time. But there is considerable uncertainty around many of these projections. So there's uncertainty as over which species are going to be impacted, where their distributions may move to, how much they may potentially shift or shrink in size, when these things may happen, what the most appropriate actions are that will help them to adapt, and how human adaptation is going to change all of this. So given all those uncertainties, it's absolutely critical that we initiate now monitoring of important biodiversity that we're concerned about in the face of climate change. So what should we be monitoring? Well, clearly, if we want to understand the impacts of our adaptation actions, we need to be monitoring the process. What are these actions? What area are they implemented over? To what degree of intensity? But perhaps more important, we need to be monitoring the targets. What are the species and habitats, and how may their distribution, their demography, extent and condition, how may those be changing over time. We also need to know what's going on with other pressures to these species, because climate change will be interacting with those, and as well as the other conservation responses that are being put into place, conservation actions and policy interventions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about BirdLife's approach to these issues, which really has two strands, one focused on systematic bird population monitoring across at a national scale or regional scale, and then site-specific monitoring at important areas of biodiversity, or bird areas we call them, focused on the state pressure responses at these sites. So bird population monitoring is based on stratified sampling, semi-randomized or randomized censusing, using standardized methods, not always the same methods in all countries, but standardized over time, so you can detect changes in abundance. Often involving large numbers of trained volunteers, many thousands of people involved in these censuses, coordinated at the local and national scale. Such monitoring allows you to develop indicators. These are based on the average population trends of suites of species that are characteristic of particular habitats. So the top graph here shows a sustainable development indicator used by the UK government based on wild bird populations. And the lower graph shows a number of articles for different habitats in different regions. And by showing these population trends for species that are characteristic of those habitats, you can get a sense of the broader environmental trends. But we can also integrate these data with information on climate change impacts. So those species distribution models I mentioned earlier on that relate the distribution of species to climatic variables and then project where the species may be distributed in the future. If we do that for a whole suite of species, we can then divide them into a pot of species for which we project that they will increase in distribution with climate change, and a group for which we expect them to suffer under climate change. If you then work out the average population trends of those two suites of species, you can then get an index of the impacts of climate on their population abundance. So this shows such an indicator for European birds, with the ones in red being the average population trends of the species we expect to do well under climate change, and those in blue show the ones that we expect to suffer. And one thing to notice is 3 times as many species that we project to suffer range contraction from climate change than range expansion. If you then plot the ratio between those 2 lines, you come up with an overall indicator showing the impacts of climate change on the species population size. The second approach is to focus on really key sites that are priorities for biodiversity conservation. And BirdLife's approach is to identify important bird areas. There are over 11,000 of these across the world, identified nationally through multi-stakeholder processes, using standardized criteria based on the populations of suites of species of conservation concern. And we're now rolling out a framework for monitoring these sites to understand trends in biodiversity happening. It's a very simple framework designed to be applied by people with relatively little technical knowledge or training. So it could be local communities or national park wardens or NGOs or volunteers. And it focuses on monitoring the state of these sites, looking at those species of conservation interest or the habitats that support them, the pressures upon the site, and the conservation responses. So the state focuses on changes in the population abundance of those key species of conservation concern relative to a reference baseline. And it's either the proportional change in the population or the condition and extent of the habitats that support them. The pressure focuses on identifying what are the key threats to the site and what is the timing, the scope and the severity of those threats. So the scope being the proportion of the populations or the area that's impacted by the threats, and the severity being the rate of decline or the degree of degradation that's being caused. And those are integrated automatically to calculated impact score. And finally, the responses focus on the conservation designation of the site, the state of management planning, and the degree to which the necessary actions are being implemented. So this shows an example for Kenya, for about 36 important bird areas, showing trends in those variables, both for sites that are protected and those that are not. And you can see that the state of the protected sites is slightly better, marginally lower pressures, but significantly improved responses. So how do we incorporate climate change into all of this? Well, we're just beginning to grapple with this challenge, but these are some of the things that we're considering. It's probably going to be necessary to bring in some really basic climate monitoring at all of these sites. We need to focus our efforts particularly on the species and sites that we expect to be impacted the soonest. We know that in areas which are topographically variable, we expect climatic zones to move upslope, therefore we should be really focusing on recording the altitudinal distribution of this species. We need to monitor the implementation of the actions that we're implementing in sites to try and help species to adapt. And we're also developing a module focused on understanding the benefits to local people, to people generally, through ecosystem service provision by the biodiversity of those sites. So we need to start thinking about how climate change is going to affect ecosystem services as well. So let's very brief rattle through two approaches to monitoring and how climate change can be integrated into them to help us understand and monitor and evaluate the impacts of our adaptation. Thank you.
Thanks, Stu. So our next speaker is Mary Pine, and she'll be talking about emerging lessons